In a lot of jazz lessons, then chord progressions are reduced to scales, and then that's the only way you try to understand what's being played. Now, obviously, that is important, but you can learn so much more. This is really just scratching the surface of the music and not really helping you make your own lines, which is probably why you are studying the licks in the first place. Even before I was playing jazz, I was always more interested in trying to figure out how to make my own version of whatever lick or solo I came across. I didn't just want to copy what I've taken off an album, and I think we should take that approach. I'm going to show you some failures in trying to make my own licks later in the video. Let's say that you transcribed a line like this. Now, probably the thing that you actually find great about a lick like this one is not going to be what notes are used or the scales for each chord. If that was the case, then you could just take all the notes, scramble them around at random, but that doesn't sound that great. That sounds like this.
And now for something completely different.
When I was still just starting out learning jazz and sitting and practicing, checking out some Parker lines, I clearly remember having a lot of trouble with a few of his lines because I couldn't really make my own version of them. One of the first ones was this Parker octave displacement lick. And it was just impossible to move it around and get it to work. And I tried all these other different combinations and tried to write something that worked, but either it didn't resolve or just didn't sound good. And I could not figure out what was missing, but something was certainly missing. Let's start by going just a little bit deeper. A jazz lick is a melody, and I think sometimes we forget that, maybe because we zoom in too much on the chord or the notes that are being played. Melodies are not just individual notes next to each other. They are longer stories, and very often they also have building blocks. This is true for jazz melodies. For example, if you listen to In the Mood, you'll hear how that's built of a repeating first inversion major triad. But this is also the case with songs like the jazz standard All of Me, which also uses a first inversion major triad and in fact continues with a root position triad as the next phrase. Instead of just looking at the individual notes that are being played in a solo, then it can be really useful to recognize which structures are being played and how they sound. Similar to how Charlie Parker loves to use a minor 7 flat 5 arpeggio from the third of a dominant chord. This can give you melodies and sounds that you can use in your own playing. It can also help you find new melodies in another way, which I'll show you in a bit. Let's first just look at another example and start with identifying some of the harmonic structures being used. Here you have a D minor 7 arpeggio, then a B flat major triad, then we get an A flat major triad, and a D flat minor triad on the C7 altered. On the F major 7, you have an A minor 7 arpeggio. But there are also other melodies that you want to recognize besides arpeggios and triads. We don't have rules or exact names for them, but that's also not that important, since it's more important that you have a way to identify them, how you think about them, and how they sound to you. Whether you call something a honeysuckle rose arpeggio, a pivot arpeggio, or octave displacement of an arpeggio, it's pretty much the same thing. This example uses a few different melodic building blocks that are very common in jazz, besides the arpeggios and the triads. Now, in general, when you analyze lines, then start with the things that you can easily recognize. Here, that would be the arpeggios. So we have a B flat major 7 arpeggio, and also an E major 7 sharp 5 arpeggio on the C7 altered. Before the B flat major 7 arpeggio, you have an enclosure of the B flat. And the phrase after the arpeggio on the C7 altered is a scale melody with a chromatic leading note. So on the F major 7, you have a scale run from A down to F, but with an added lower chord tone. It is incredibly useful to have these small, flexible building blocks in your vocabulary, and you want to know more than just the arpeggios and the triads, so make sure to check out a lot of different enclosures, different ways of doing scale runs, and other melodic techniques that you can dig up and use in your own playing. But this is still about what is being played and not why it sounds good. Let's have a look at how you might describe the melody that you're playing, something that I think we don't spend nearly enough time on in jazz education. It is one thing that you can use the arpeggios and triads to make melodies, but you also still need to connect those melodies across the chords for it to be a really great line. This is something that's maybe not taught that often, and I think we still miss some of the tools to really describe what's going on. But let's just start with some techniques that you probably already know and that you can also really see work, and then I'm gonna go into a few that are just sort of my personal way of describing melody. This is a clear example of a basic motif that's moved from chord to chord using voice leading. And this is a great way to tie together phrases across chords. And you can also see that it doesn't have to be too obvious. Another way is to have a specific melodic idea and then use that as a motif where you're letting that flow through the changes. That could be something like this. Here the skipping arpeggio melody is working as a motif that's continuing through the line, creating melodic tension as well as harmonic tension on the C7 altered. Both resolve once we reach the F major 7. You can also use shifting phrases as a type of motivic development. In this example, the arpeggio melody on the G minor 7 is shifted to an E flat minor 7 melody on the C7 altered, which works really well. And in that way, there is a motif that is developed through the line. The other well-known type of melodic development is call response, which sounds something like this. Call response phrase will have two parts, a call and a response. Here you have an ascending call on the G minor 7, and then a descending response on the C7 altered. Call response can also be seen as a sort of melodic tension and release. So in a simplified version, you can think of a melodic or rhythmic tension on one chord that then resolves on the next chord. This example is creating tension with melody, and I'm using arpeggios and large intervals on the G minor 7 and then resolving that tension with some more stepwise motion on the C7 altered. Rhythm can also be a great way to create some tension and release. Here you have syncopation on G minor 7, creating tension that then resolves on the C7. And that is really what ties together these two melodies. Very often when you don't have any connection between the melodies and the chords, then the solo becomes very abstract and it doesn't really have a natural flow to it. Two of the guitarists that I admire the most for connecting phrases in this way would be Wes Montgomery and Pat Metheny. And if you want to take a look at how Wes uses these techniques and how it is a huge part of what makes him a musical genius, then check out this video.